All right, so welcome to Med Talks with the Wellness Company. I'm Christopher Alexander, and I'm here today with Robert Seek, who is out in Las Vegas, Nevada with Partel Pharmacy. Robert, can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your expertise?
Sure. Well, my name is Robert Seek. I am a pharmacist. I'm a pharmacy owner. I graduated pharmacy school in 1995. I've been out of school for a while. And I spent a good portion of my career since then actually working in the pharmaceutical and biotech industries. My focus was infectious disease. I did buy an independent pharmacy, primarily focused on compounding in Las Vegas. That business has grown and led me to work with a number of companies like the Wellness Company.
So you studied to become a pharmacist. You worked in the industry, saw the good and the bad of it. Then you've now owned a pharmacy. So you've kind of gone from the business side to being a practitioner. I maybe have that out of order to being an owner of a pharmacy as well. Is that a normal pathway for people?
There are very few pharmacists actually that go to work in industry. So part of that pathway is probably unique for me to go from working from chain drugstores to drug industry to owning a pharmacy. Working for chain drugstores or hospitals to owning an independent pharmacy, many pharmacists do pursue. But what it's done for me from the business perspective to what I do now is opened my eyes to a lot of what's valuable in terms of operating treatment. I don't run a typical dispensing pharmacy, and you mentioned being a practitioner. The FMNM that you see after my PharmD is a fellow in metabolic and nutritional medicine. That's a totally separate training outside of pharmacy school, where we add a functional or integrative component that is brought to the list of products that are available at my pharmacy, prescription and non-prescription. So kind of unique, I think. I'm in that history.
Great. And then on top of that, of course, you are your pharmacy is online and can serve patients online as well as locally. But we wanted to talk about today in particular. We've had discussions with naturopaths and pharmacists and doctors, and now you're kind of a combination of pharmacist and pharmacy owner. But is ivermectin? It went from a Nobel Prize nominated medicine to the most dangerous drug apparently that ever existed, according to the FDA. So can you tell us a little bit about ivermectin and its history?
Well, ivermectin was first discovered in 1975. It was a Japanese researcher. It was patented first and approved for animal use for parasitic infections, worms, and other critters. But in the early 80s, it started to be approved in major countries. Japan was the first to approve it in humans. The United States approved it as well. And in 2015, four men shared the Nobel Prize in Science and Medicine for their work on ivermectin, primarily for one thing, a particular type of parasitic infection, a worm infection, primarily transmitted by a certain fly in Africa that caused river blindness. Patients would have a number of symptoms due to that infection, but tens of millions of people had river blindness essentially cured because of this drug. And that was the beginning of ivermectin's fame, which is amazing. And it's been on the market for decades.
And so now ivermectin has been prescribed as an off-label use for treating COVID and other upper respiratory infections. How common is an off-label prescription? It seems to be, we're led to believe that this is incredibly unusual and therefore making it even more dangerous than it already was before. Is there any truth to that?
Now, let's talk about what that term means, off-label. So when a pharmaceutical company is researching a particular drug, they pick one target. We call that an indication. What are we researching this drug for? They build a clinical trial, which costs money. Typically, you're working with university centers or independent research centers, and you put together inclusion, exclusion criteria, you follow data, and if your data proves what you believe it will, that it's effective for this one thing, you submit that to the FDA, you get an indication. So that big package insert that pharmacists pull out of the prescription bottles, that's on there. We call that the label, indications for use. The drug industry at that time can decide, well, do we want to expand this label, meaning spend money on clinical trials to show that this drug is used for other things? It's already on the market, so we'll claim these things. And that's what drug companies can do with their sales arms. They can only market what is on label. They can't off label promote. However, I did my MBA, Chris, in 2003. I was studying prescription drug utilization, and over 60% of drugs prescribed at the time were prescribed off label. So, what does that mean? I'll just give you a couple of quick examples. The drug gabapentin, brand name was Neuron. Okay, so it was first approved for neuropathies, but it's used for chronic pain. Antidepressants that were used obviously for depression, but you have one drug, fluoxetine, the brand name Prozac, that was used off label for premenstrual syndrome. There's a number of that. So 60%, that's the number to focus on. 60% of prescribing today is outside the approved label.
Well, that's again sort of staggering given the way that it was communicated. Let me ask you this. So we hear, ivermectin is allegedly dangerous. And if ivermectin was anywhere near as dangerous as they claim, then I think we could safely assume the FDA, CDC, law enforcement would love to find someone prescribing it who's prescribed it and there's been an adverse reaction so that they could bring them to justice and talk about the evils of ivermectin. So with this pretty serious risk to a business, and the government, no doubt, aggressively looking to prosecute, one, would you still carry it? And two, if you're still carrying it, have you ever seen any significant problems?
I carry it. I will continue to carry it. I carried it during COVID. And I look at my role as a pharmacist. When I first moved from Pennsylvania to Nevada, where my pharmacy is, I remember studying for the law exam, and one of the first paragraphs in the prep guide was, pharmacist's role is to ensure the safe delivery of medication to the patient as the practitioner intended. So we can talk about that a little bit later and expand on that. And when a practitioner is ordering ivermectin, I'm going to dispense it. Now, it's my job as a pharmacist to make sure safe delivery of the medication to the patient, not a judgment, to basically challenge the clinical application, but to make sure that there's no contraindication that I know of in the patient's profile. For example, anaphylactic reaction to certain drugs, a drug interaction. That would be a time when I could call the practitioner and say, look, there's something going on here. I'm concerned about it. Not stop the prescribing necessarily and encourage switching to something else, but make the practitioner aware. But if that practitioner says, Robert, the benefits of my prescribing this drug for this particular patient far outweigh the risk, yes, I want you to dispense it. So that's one thing with the pharmacist's role. But you asked about more pertains to the adverse event reporting. So let me just be succinct in how I looked at ivermectin and its use for, say, COVID-19. You have a drug that has been on the market worldwide for decades. And in every country that keeps an adverse drug event reporting database, the reports for ivermectin have been minimal. The drug has been used in the very young and the very old. So that's a pretty good amount of safety data, okay? So I look at that first when it comes to dispensing the ivermectin. And Chris, I think I talked a little bit too much, lost track of the main question because I wanted to circle around to it. So just
I know you're good.
That was.
We can cut it right there.
Okay.
It'll be fine. So after claiming ivermectin was the worst thing to ever happen to humanity, Big Pharma then started to raise prices for ivermectin. Can you talk a little bit about that and sort of the what Partel Pharmacies, the way you found to get around that? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, the interesting thing is I actually filled very few prescriptions of ivermectin before COVID. So in looking at the price history data, say 2019 or prior, ivermectin commercially available tablets, 3 milligram tablets, would probably have an acquisition cost to a pharmacy like mine of $1.50 per tablet. So that doubled or more than doubled during COVID. But what was important is the fact that it was very difficult to find. I couldn't find ivermectin more than 30 tablets at a time from the 3 major wholesalers. So my question is, was that designed? But tertiary or secondary wholesalers that I use, I could find plenty of ivermectin. Minimum order quantities went up. So the price doubled, and I had to buy a minimum of 100,000 tablets at a time, and not from primary wholesalers. They just didn't have it, or they very much limited distribution, which was alarming.
And what do you think was behind the limited distribution? Is that a market effect, or is that a government effect?
I think there are two things to explain it. Number one, there simply is a deficiency of generic drug manufacturing in the country, the United States. The drug did not have high demand until COVID, but it did become available, and demand was met by manufacturers. I was able to buy the ivermectin tablets. I do think there was a lot of fear driven toward practitioners who would prescribe and pharmacies about dispensing ivermectin for COVID, fear driven because of that term, off label, which is bogus. We've proven that it's bogus. So whether or not pharmacies would get in trouble for dispensing it, certain states like my state, Nevada, actually banned hydroxychloroquine. I never obeyed the ban. The governor and his chief medical officer were sued because of the ban, as was the Nevada Medical Board. I'm sorry, the Pharmacy Board. But the limitations of use of ivermectin came out of fear, and distribution was an issue, but I was able to acquire it. I also compounded. So one of the good things about a compounding pharmacy is just the economics of buying what we call the API, the active pharmaceutical ingredient, ivermectin, and how it's dosed for COVID, which is body weight. It's much more economical to actually compound capsules at a much higher dose than 3 milligrams for the patients. But we have both.
So you compounding is one way that you've kind of gotten around these smaller tablets and the amount that's needed and the way costs have gone up. And a lot of people have heard about compounding being an effective approach to a lot of different medications. Can you talk a little bit about the benefits of going to a compounding pharmacy?
You have the first application of compounding pharmacy that's how pharmacy was. Recipes were put together of various herbs for your pharmaceuticals. But, in the modern sense, you have a lot of drugs approved for adult use that may be useful for pediatricians, for pediatric applications that are just not available in pediatric dosage form. And the same for pets. So that's kind of the first layer of what compounding pharmacies can make available. The second of that is drugs that you need a prescription for that are not manufactured commercially, just because the demand is so low, you go to a compounding pharmacy. So, for example, there are probably 50,000 independent pharmacies in the country, Chris. 5,000 are compounders. So it is a small niche, which means the drugs that we make are also a small niche too. But everything is approved to be on the market by the FDA, and we just make in dosage forms or strengths that are not commercially available. And some of that reason is because they're just not manufactured. There's not enough incentive for it.